everyone, good day. I am Merlin Umboy Ampalo and we are tasked to have a brief summary of the first voyage around the world by Magellan by Antonio Pigafetta. But before jumping into the significant detail of this report, let us have a recap or some backgrounds of the main characters in this report. Ferdinand Magellan. He was a Portuguese explorer and the subject of the Hispanic monarchy from 1518. The first European to cross the Pacific Ocean was Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan was exposed to stories of the great Portuguese and Spanish rivalry for sea exploration and dominance over the spice trade in the East Indies, especially the Spice Islands or Moluccas in modern Indonesia. He was intrigued by the promise of fame and riches. Magellan developed an interest in maritime discovery in those early years. In the 15th century, spices were at the epicenter of the world economy, much like oil is today, highly valued for flavoring and preserving food, as well as making the taste of meat gone bad. Spices like cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and especially black pepper were extremely valuable. Europeans had reached the Spice Islands by sailing east, but none had yet to sail west from Europe to reach the other side of the globe. Magellan was determined to be the first to do so. So those are some reasons why Magellan traveled all around the globe, came to different countries, especially here in the Philippines. Next is Antonio Pigafetta. Antonio Pigafetta is an Italian scholar and explorer. He joined the expedition to the Spice Islands led by explorer Ferdinand Magellan under the flag of the Emperor Charles V, and after Magellan's death in the Philippine Islands, the subsequent voyage around the world. Antonio Pigafetta served as Magellan's assistant and kept an accurate journal, which later assisted him in translating the Cebuano language. Pigafetta was one of the 18 men who made the complete trip, returning to Spain in 1522, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, out of the approximately 240 who set out 3 years earlier. Pigafetta's surviving journal is the source for much of what is known about Magellan and Elcano's voyage. Pigafetta Travelogues is one of the most important primary sources in the study of pre-colonial Philippines. In addition, his account was also a major reference to the events leading to Magellan's arrival in the Philippines, his encounter with local leaders, his death in the hands of Lapu-Lapu's forces in the Battle of Mactan, and in the departure of what was left of Magellan's fleet in the islands. For this chapter, we will focus on the chronicles of Antonio Pigafetta. When we say chronicles, it is a historical account of events arranged in chronological order, as in a timeline. Typically, equal weight is given for historically important events and local events, the purpose being the recording of events and that occurred seen from the perspective of the chronicler. So going back, Antonio Pigafetta, as he wrote his first-hand observation and general impression of the Far East, reached what he called their fleet reached what he called the Ladrones Islands, or the Islands of the Thieves. He recounted, "These people have no arms, but use sticks which have a fishbone at the end. They are poor but ingenious, and great thieves, and for the sake of that, we call these 3 islands the Ladrones Islands. This Ladrones Islands is presently known as the Marianas Islands. These islands are located southeast of Japan, west-southwest of Hawaii, north of New Guinea, and east of the Philippines." 10 days after, they reached Ladrones Islands. Pigafetta reported that they reached what Pigafetta called the Isle of Zamal, now Samar. We called it Samar, but Magellan decided to land in another uninhabited islands for greater security where they could rest for a few days. After 2 days, on March 18, 9 men came to them and showed joy and eagerness in seeing them. Magellan realized that the men were reasonable and welcomed them with food, drinks, and gifts. In turn, the natives gave them fish, palm wine or uruka, figs, and 2 cocos. The natives also gave them rice, or in our native language we call it umay, cocos, and other food supplies. Pigafetta detailed in amazement and fascination the palm tree which bore fruits called cocoa and wine. He also described what seemed like a coconut. The fleet went to Humunu Island, and then there they found that Pigafetta refers to as the watering place of good signs. It is in the place where Pigafetta wrote that they found the first signs of gold in the island. They named the island with the nearby islands as the archipelago of Saint Lazarus, then left the island. So at this point, Miss Elgin Adam will continue this report.
Okay, would be the continuation. March 25, Pigafetta recounted that they saw two balanghay, which is balangay, a longboat full of people in Mazava. King of Balangay sent his men to the ship of Magellan. European entertained these men to give them gifts. The king of Balangay offered to give Magellan a bar of gold and a chest of inger. Magellan declined. Magellan sent the interpreter to the king and asked for money for the needs of his ships and expressed that he came into the islands as a friend and not as enemy. The king responded by giving Magellan the ended provision of food in Chinaware. They both exchanged gifts, Turkish fashions, red cups, and gave the people knives and mirror. Then the two expressed their desires to become brothers. After a few days, Magellan was introduced to the king's brothers, who was also a king of another island. They went to this island, and Pigafetta reported that they saw mines of gold. Ria Kalambo, king of Zuluan and Kalagan, Butuan, and Karaguan, the most handsome of all the men that he saw in this place. Adorned with silk and gold accessories like a golden dagger, which is carried with him in a wooden polished sheath. And the first king was Raya Shagu. On March 31, which happened to be Easter Sunday, Magellan ordered the complaint to preside a mass by the shore. The king heard of this plan and sent to the dead pigs and attended the mass with the other king. Pigafetta reported that both kings participated in the mass. After 7 days, Magellan and his men decided to move and look for islands where they could acquire more supplies and provisions. They learned of the islands of Ceylon, which is Leyte, Bohol, Zubu, which is Cebu, and they intended to go there. Ria Kalambu offered to pilot them in going to Cebu, the largest and the richest of the island. By April 7 of the same year, Magellan and his men reached the port of Cebu. The king of Cebu, through Magellan's interpreter, demanded that they pay tribute as it was customary, but Magellan refused. Magellan said that he was a captain of a king himself and those would not pay tribute to other kings. Magellan's interpreter explained to the king of Cebu that Magellan king was the emperor of a great empire and that it would do them to make friends with them than to forge enmity. The king of Cebu consulted his council. By the next day, Magellan's men, the king of Cebu, together with another principal men of Cebu, met in an open space. There the king offered a bit of his blood and demanded that Magellan do the same. The following day, Magellan spoke before the people of Cebu about peace and God. Pigafetta reported that the people talked leisure and Magellan's speech. Magellan then asked the people would success the king after his reign, and the people responded that the eldest child of the king, who had happened to be a daughter, would be the next in line. Pigafetta also related how the people talk about how at old age parents were no longer taken into the account and had to follow the orders of their children as a new leader of the land. Magellan responded to this by saying that his faith entitled children to render honor and obedience to their parents. Magellan preached about their faith further and people were productively convinced according according to Pigafetta that their men are overjoyed seeing that the people wish to become a Christian to their free will, not because they were forced or intimidated. On the 14th of April, the people gathered with the king and the other principal men of the islands. The mass was conducted on the 26th of April. Zola is a principal man from the islands of Mactan, which is Mactan, went to see Magellan and asked him for a boat full of men so that we would be able to fight the chief named Silapu-Lapu, which is Lapu-Lapu. Such chief, according to Zula, refused to obey the king and was also preventing him from doing so. Magellan offered 3 boats instead that expressed his desire to go to Mactan himself. The shed shift. Magellan force arrived in the Mactan in daylight. They numbered 49 in total, and the islanders in Mactan were estimated to number 1,500. The battle began. Magellan died in the battle. The natives, seeing that the bodies of the enemies were protected with armors, aimed to their legs instead. Magellan was pierced with poison arrow in his right leg. A few of their men charged at the natives and tried to intimidate them by burning an entire village, but this only enraged the natives further. Magellan was especially target because of the natives know that he was the captain general. Magellan was hit with a lance in the face. Magellan retaliated with spurs and the same native with the lance of the breast and the third to draw his sword but could not felt it because of his wooden arm. Seeing that the captain was deteriorated, more natives came to attack him. One native with a great sword delivered a blow in Magellan's left leg, brought him face down. The native ceaselessly attacked Magellan with lanced swords and even with their bare hands. Pigafetta also said that the king of Cebu, who was baptized, could have sent help, but Magellan instructed him not to join the battle and stay in the Balangay so that we would see how they fought. The king offered the people of Mactan gifts of any value and amount in exchange of Magellan's body, but the chief refused. They wanted to keep Magellan's body as a memento of their victory. Magellan men elected Duarte Barbosa as the new captain. Pigafetta also told how Magellan slave, the interpreter named Herney betrayed them and told the king of Cebu that they intended to leave as quickly as possible. Pigafetta alleged that the slave told the king that if he followed the slave's advice, then the king could acquire ships and the goods of Magellan's fleet. The two conspired. Betrayed what was left to the Magellan men. The king invited these men to the gathering where he said he would present the jewels and he would send for the king of Spain. Pigafetta was not able to join the 24 men who attended because he was nursing his battle wounds. The natives had slain all of the men except the interpreter and Juan Serrano, who was already wanted. Serrano was presented and shouted at the man in the ship asking them to pay ransom so he would be spared. However, they refused and would not allow anyone to go their shore. The fleet departed the abandoned Serrano. They left Cebu and continued their journey around the world.
At this point, let us have an analysis of Pigafetta's chronicle. The Chronicle of Pigafetta was one of the most cited documents by historians who wished to study the pre-colonial Philippines. As one of the earliest written accounts, Pigafetta was seen as a credible source for a period which was prior unchronicled and undocumented. Moreover, being the earliest detailed documentation, it was believed that Pigafetta's writings account for the purest pre-colonial society. Indeed, Pigafetta's work is of great importance in the study and writing of Philippine history. A student of history should recognize certain bases accompanying the author and his identity, loyalties, and circumstances that he was in, and how it affected the text that he produced. In the case of Pigafetta, the reader needs to understand that he was a chronicler, commissioned by the King of Spain to accompany and document voyage intended to expand the Spanish Empire. Pigafetta came from a rich family in Italy. These attributes influence his narrative, his selection of details to be included in the text, his characterization of the people and of the species that he encountered, and his interpretation and retelling of the events. Being a scholar of cartography and geography, Pigafetta was able to give details on geography and climate of the place that their voyage had reached. In reading Pigafetta's description of the people, one has to keep in mind that he was coming from a 16th century European perspective. Hence, the reader might notice how Pigafetta, whether implicitly or explicitly, regarded the indigenous belief systems and way of life as inferior to that of Christianity and of the Europeans. He would always remark on the nakedness of the natives or how he was fascinated by their exotic culture. Pigafetta also noticeably emphasized the natives' amazement and illiteracy to the European artillery, merchandise, and other goods in the same way that Pigafetta repeatedly mentioned the abundance of spices like ginger and of precious metals like gold. His observations and assessments of the indigenous cultures employ the European standards. Hence, when they saw the indigenous attires of the natives, Pigafetta saw them as being naked because from the European standpoint, they were wearing fewer clothes indeed. Pigafetta's perspective was too narrow to realize that such attire was only appropriate to the tropical climate of the islands. The same way true for materials that the natives used for their houses like palm and bamboo. These materials would let more air come through the house and compensate for the hot climate in the islands. It should be understood that such observations were rooted from the context of Pigafetta and of his era. Europe, for example, was dominated by the Holy Roman Empire, whose loyalty and purpose was the domination of the Catholic Church all over the world. Hence, other belief systems different from that of Christianity were perceived to be blasphemous and barbaric, even demonic. Aside from this, the 16th century European economy was the mercantilist. Such system measures the wealth of kingdoms based on their accumulation of bullions or precious metals like gold and silver. It was not surprising, therefore, that Pigafetta would always mention the abundance of gold in the islands, as shown in his descriptions of leaders wearing gold rings and golden daggers, and of the rich gold mines. An empire like that of the Spain would indeed search for new lands where they could acquire more gold and wealth to be on top of all European nations. The obsession with spices might be odd for Filipinos because of its ordinariness in the Philippines, but understanding the context would reveal that spices were scarce in Europe and hence were seen as prestige goods in that era. Spain and Portugal coveted the control of Spice Island because it would have led to a certain increase in wealth, influence, and power. This context should be used and understood in order to have a more qualified reading of Pigafetta's account. So that's all for the analysis of Pigafetta's Chronicles.